Okay, guys, so let's get started on this second part. So this is like a kind of like a spin-off of our last lecture on the epipelagic. We're going to be talking about epipelagic food webs. Okay, so a food web involves a lot of different organisms, and they're all interacting in a trophic way. So we'll go check that out. How does the epipelagic food web go? This is a food web, right? This is an example of just a normal food web in the ocean. And what do you guys see? A bunch of organisms, right? A bunch of organisms with arrows in between. What do the arrows represent? They represent that. What was that? Yeah, what they eat, basically. So the arrow, notice the direction that it points. It's really tempting to say that I'm pointing towards what I'm eating. I'm going to eat that thing. But it's actually the opposite. You guys see that? Yeah. It's actually the opposite. It actually points towards the consumer. All right, so that's the first thing we got to realize. The arrows point to the consumer, and why is it not the other way around? Why is this anchovy not saying, I'm going to eat this copepod? It's because actually these arrows are supposed to represent energy flow. All right, and remember, food is energy, right? You eat food to get energy in your body, so the energy that's inside the body of these plankton goes into the energy of this copepod when they eat it. All right, and then the energy that's in the body of this copepod goes into these fish when they eat the copepod. All right, so the arrows, they actually represent energy flow along the whole food web, and you see the energy is flowing from the bottom to the top over here. Okay, so these ones are the most energetic. Okay, they ate all these, which ate all of these, right? Probably a lot of familiar concepts going to come around soon. Okay, and we're going to go back and talk about trophic pyramids and stuff. So notice how there's all these arrows, right? You can actually isolate a certain set of arrows, and you'll get something really interesting, right? So maybe let's follow a sequence of arrows randomly, right? How about these ones right here? Start with this arrow from diatoms up to this C. carinatus copepod. Okay, so if you decide to follow that arrow all the way up, just pick one, right? Follow it over here. Okay, follow that arrow from the prawn up to, how about that fish right there, the snook? Okay, so we go from here all the way to there. What do we have? If we ignored everything else, what is that? You guys realize? It's a food chain. Yeah, I mean, you're on the right track, right? It has something to do with food, trophic pyramid, but it's a food chain, right? A food chain is just a part of the food web. You can go in any such path, right? How about we take an alternative? Instead of going to the prawn, we go over this way, and then this way, and this way, and then up. That's another food chain, right? Connect any series of arrows that you like, and you get a food chain. So a food web is a collection of the food chains, right? All the food chains, all the different interactions, the trophic interactions inside the ecosystem. But the thing is, you see how it gets really, really complicated with all these crazy arrows. It's much easier if we were to just look at the food chain. This. See, let's compare food web, food chain, right? Which one's better? I don't know. They're both equally good, right? Because they both have their pros and cons. Here's the thing. This food chain is really nice to look at, right? It's very, it makes a lot of sense, and it's informative. Okay, it's easy to understand. But the thing is it the case that anchovies only eat copepods? Is it the case that the only thing that anchovies get eaten by is this tuna? Now, anchovies probably get eaten by other things, and anchovies have other food sources as well. So this gives you an easy to understand but incomplete picture, right? If you want to go detailed and have the accurate information, then food web is the way to go. Right? But then if you want to explain a concept, then you should not use the food web because it's too confusing. Right? Instead, a food chain would be more preferential for educational purposes. Right? It's good for showing concepts. It's very simple and diluted, but it does not show the whole picture. Right? So if you want to see for accuracy here, for simplicity and ease over here. Okay, so that's the difference between food webs and food chains. You guys can take a look at this. I summarized what I just said. Okay? Okay, so anyways, now that we know when we use each one, let's take a look at this food chain, right? So we can illustrate the concept of the trophic pyramid. Can we name off the trophic levels? Right? What's this one? Well, yes, but I mean, what trophic level is it? What do you got? Did you you say something?
Tertiary
Tertiary consumer, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's check. What's this one? Primary producer. Primary consumer. Secondary consumer. Tertiary consumer. Okay, good. So we know our trophic levels, right? And this is quaternary consumer, but since it has no natural predators, what should we call it? The apex predator, right? Okay, so this is just, a food chain, and it shows all the trophic levels as we expect, and they fit nicely on the trophic pyramid that we have seen before, right? Now, going back to the trophic pyramid, what does this even mean? It means biomass, right? So the size of this, this tier, right, this level, is representative of the amount of organisms there, the biomass, right? And so here's the definition of biomass, right? So we didn't really give a formal definition yet, but here it is, right? We've been talking about this whole time, and I have been explaining it as if you want to look at a certain group, take them all and weigh it, then you get the biomass of that group. Okay, and here I have some examples of different groups that we can use, right? If you want to know the biomass of plankton, the biomass of holoplankton, all the way down, biomass of humans, right? Okay, you want to talk about a certain group of organisms, weigh them all, you get the biomass. Okay, so that's what biomass means, and in general, the biomass of all the primary consumers combined is greater than the biomass of all the secondary consumers combined. Now here's the new question. How much greater is it? Or the other way around, how much less secondary consumers are there than this? All right, we can figure that out if we had some numbers, right? We can use this equation here called the trophic level transfer efficiency. Right, trophic level transfer efficiency talks about how much of the food energy here ends up here, and how much of the food energy here ends up here. So going back to the Foodweb example, do you realize that the arrows were pointing up, right? So the energy was transferring from one trophic level to the next every time it is eaten. Right? When a copepod eats a phytoplankton, the energy gets transferred up from primary producers to primary consumers. Okay, but how much, right? Well, the amount is you take the biomass of the higher level, so primary consumers, for example, and divide it by the biomass of the lower level that you're interested in. So this one right here. And then you multiply by 100% to get the percentage, and trophic level transfer efficiency comes out to be a percentage. All right, so this could vary across different ecosystems, but the general rule of thumb is that we could say it is equal to 10%. Right? The trophic level transfer efficiency is 10%. The amount of energy in secondary consumers combined, only 10% of that energy makes it into the tertiary consumers. Right? And as a consequence of that, the amount of tertiary consumer biomass that is supported by this amount of secondary consumer is 10% of the secondary consumer. Right? So I'm saying all the same thing, I'm just rewording it, right? I can reword it a couple different ways too. How many more secondary consumers are there than tertiary consumers? If this is 10% of this, then this is 10 times that. Does that kind of make sense? So 10% of something is 1/10, and 10 is 10 times bigger than 1. So it goes both ways. Right? So the rule of thumb, 10% allows us to use this really easy way to estimate the biomass. Safe to estimate the biomass to be 10 times higher if you're below and 10 times lower if you're above. Okay? So if I were to give you the biomass of one of the levels, you can estimate the biomass of an adjacent level. And then from there, you can estimate the biomass of all the other levels. Right? So we could try that, right? If we start at tertiary consumers, and I tell you there are 500 kilograms of tertiary consumer, then could you tell me how many apex predators there are? Or is there not how many? What is the biomass of the apex predators? 50 kilograms. Does that make sense? 10 times less. 10% of 500 is 50. Right? Trophic level transfer, if we assume it is 10%. Right? What is the biomass of the secondary consumers?
5,000.
It would be 5,000 kilograms. Right? And then you can go all the way down. Primary consumers? 50,000. Primary producers, 500,000 kilograms. Okay, so they scale by tens if the trophic level transfer efficiency is assumed to be the rule of thumb 10%. Okay, does that make sense? So let's just always assume that, there's going to be 10 times more of the prey than the predator, and there's going to be 10 times less of the predator than the prey. Okay, so we can use that to continue our discussion under the food web. So let's continue on. The biomass of the herring that the tuna eats is approximately 10 times the biomass of the tuna. Is that okay? Right, because that is 1 trophic level below it. Right, if it were 2 trophic levels below it, then it would be 100 times. Right, but in this case it's 1, so let's just say it's 10 times. All right. Similarly, every time the tuna eats the herring, what percentage of the herring does the tuna get to keep? 10%. That is the transfer efficiency, right? There is energy in the body of the herring. The tuna eats the whole herring, but the tuna only gets to keep 10% of it, right? Because that's the transfer efficiency. If it were 100%, then it would get to keep all of the herring that it ate, but that is not the case, right? Instead, we get something like this. 10% of the herring eaten by the tuna contributes to the biomass of its own body. Right? So that means that if a tuna eats 10 herring, how many are going to contribute to its own body?
100%.
What was that?
100%.
It's not 100. So you got to think of it in the other way. Don't multiply 10% by 10. That's not what the idea is. The idea is every time this thing eats herring, it only gets 10% of the energy. So if it eats 10 of them, how many herring contributed to its whole body? Just 1, because that is 10% of the amount that it ate. Okay? 1 of these herrings went into the body of the tuna. So what happened to the other 9 that it ate? Well, maybe you guys know. Right? What happened to the other 9?
Waste.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you ate a pound of meat, it would be pretty sad if you just gained a pound of weight, right? Because it's easy to do that, right? Then we gain a pound a day, and then we'd be really heavy. With only 100 days, we'd be 100 pounds heavier, right? But no, we only gain a certain percentage of that, and the rest of it goes into waste, right? The first one being carbon dioxide, the waste product of cellular respiration, and the second one being, what's the second waste product? Okay, yes, that is one, but I didn't include it. I'm talking about the mass, though. Okay, not necessarily like the energy. If we wanted to talk about energy, then yes, a lot of it goes into the heat. But if we want to talk about the actual molecules, right, the molecules from the food, some of it gets converted into this molecule, carbon dioxide. And what do the rest ones come out of the body as?
Nitrogen.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and you're right too, nitrogen. Yeah, which is this, okay? That's nitrogenous. Okay, so the rest comes out as poop, okay? And this is really important because poop, right, has a lot of nutrients in it, right? There's a lot of nutrients in that thing, and, plants can take that up. However, there's something different in the ocean, right? I'll get into that in a second. Keep in mind that this is happening at every single trophic level, all right? They're converting their energy that they eat into the waste products, carbon dioxide and the poop, all right, at every level. So that begs the question, considering all the energy is going from here to here and then it's being converted into this, is this a waste of energy then? What happens to all of that? Is this stuff wasted? Does it get used up by another organism or not, right? If it doesn't get used up, it's wasted, right? That's energy right here, that's free food basically. But does it, right? Well, one of them, the answer is easy. Carbon dioxide is taken up by whom? Plants, right? We know that from the ocean profiles and the action of photosynthesis, right? Plants and other primary producers take up carbon dioxide, so that's good, right? We can take all the carbon dioxide and connect an arrow to phytoplankton. Does that make sense? Why I put an arrow? Because the energy is flowing. Okay, so the phytoplankton get to take up the carbon dioxide. That is good. It gets to return back into the food web right here. So this is phytoplankton taking up the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is not wasted. Now what happens to the poop? The solid waste, right? That was a gaseous waste. The solid waste, what happens to that? Interesting thing happens in the ocean compared to land. If you poop on the land, you will get a pile right? And that pile can be taken care of easily by organisms, right? Someone can visit that pile and take as you please, right? Well, in the ocean, there's water, all right? It gets dissolved in all the water and turns into DOM, dissolved organic matter. Okay, so when fish poop in the ocean, the first thing that happens to it is it sinks, all right? After it sinks, since it's in the water, it breaks up into tiny pieces and then dissolves into DOM, okay? DOM, dissolved organic matter. And this is really important because dissolved organic matter is basically molecules. It becomes really small. Is it easy to grab then? You have a nice pile where you can just grab a piece of poop? No, right? Instead, it's just floating all around you. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do about all those nutrients? How are you going to get them back into the food web, right? Because if you don't get them back in, then they're wasted, right? Okay, so in the ocean, where all these fish are swimming, right? They're actually swimming in a bunch of DOM, right? You just can't see it because it's so small, right? What are they going to do with it? If it were chunks, the fish would probably eat it, right? But it's not. Instead, it's broken up into tiny pieces and DOM, dissolved, right? So how are you going to pick it up, right? We had to examine what DOM is first, so let's take a look at this. Going back to our discussion of profiles, right? DOM is actually a bunch of nitrogen. Yeah, you were right, nitrogen and phosphorus, all that waste, right? And what I mean by a bunch of nitrogen is it's in the form of molecules such as nitrate and ammonia and stuff like that. Okay, so let's consider the fact that we have a bunch of small molecules, right? Okay, molecules. So the waste turns into a bunch of molecules now, right? It would be nice if the waste did not turn into molecules, because if it were a chunk, then it could get eaten by a fish. But no, it turns into a bunch of molecules, which are, well, really small. I mean, molecules, right? So how do you eat something that small? What's the requirement of someone who wants to eat something that small? They also have to be really small, have a tiny mouth, right? So who would possibly be small enough to eat tiny molecules then? Maybe, right? It have to be really, really, really small. Okay, but so that's a good guess, but here's the thing: cyanobacteria don't eat, right? So that's another consideration. Right? So what are they able to, who's able to eat these, right? It has to be really small. Okay. Let's hold that thought for a second. Let's take a look at the nutrient profile to look at where it is. We had a suggestion for cyanobacteria, which is a good suggestion because they do possibly absorb some of this nutrients, right? Okay, where is most of the DOM? So you guys can see 1,000 meters, right? 1 kilometer, which is below 200 meters. Can the cyanobacteria access that DOM? No. Where are all the cyanobacteria and the rest of the primary producers located? Above 200 meters, right? Because if you're not above 200 meters, then what don't you have? What are you missing? Sunlight, right? Primary producers need sunlight, and so you can't have the cyanobacteria going down to 1,000 meters just to pick up the DOM. All right, that's the problem with DOM, right? At first, it sinks down below 200 meters, and so that the primary producers can't get it anymore. And then it becomes DOM, and now the animals can't eat it anymore because it's too small. All right, so now you got a bunch of small, hard-to-eat molecules down here where there's no cyanobacteria to pick it up. Okay, what are we gonna do, right? Who is down there that doesn't need sunlight, that is small enough to eat it? Okay, any suggestions besides cyanobacteria? And a hint, it's literally in the same domain. But what type of organism is it? Right? Other bacteria, right, besides that are not primary producers. Bacteria and archaea are the smallest organisms, and they can actually eat the DOM down below the surface. Do they need sunlight? No, they're not primary producers. They don't need the sunlight. They can exist below 200 meters and pick up that DOM. Good. All right. Is the DOM completely wasted? No, not yet at least, right? At least we know that something out there is using it. Okay. Now the trick is we need to get this back into the food web. So by now, the DOM's energy has been transferred to the bacteria. All right. So the DOM energy has been transferred to bacteria and archaea. Okay, so we made it that far, right? All of this stuff, carbon dioxide goes to the phytoplankton, we're good, and the phytoplankton get eaten, goes back to the food web, right? All the DOM goes into the bacteria and archaea, which we classified yesterday as picoplankton. Okay? Now, can picoplankton be eaten by anything in the normal food web? That is the question. If it can, then you're good. The energy has returned. But if you cannot, then we have to figure out another solution. Right? So let's examine the sizes, right? I decided to use picoplankton in this classification because it shows the size. It's a size classification. So let's look. Bacteria and archaea are picoplankton being 0.2 to 2 micrometers. Can it be eaten by zooplankton, which are mesoplankton, right? Zooplankton are mesoplankton, and that's 200 to 2,000 micrometers, making it 1,000 times bigger than the bacteria. Can they eat the bacteria then? What are you gonna say? Using the rule of size of the food compared to the size of the body, the answer is no, right? These guys, believe it or not, are too big to eat those. These are tiny, right? But they are still yet too big to eat the bacteria. You get what I'm saying here? Right? The bacteria at this point are too small to be eaten, so the energy is technically still wasted. It only goes to the bacteria and nobody else can take it from there. Right? So what does that imply? It implies that if you want to get this to eat that, which it can't, what's the only other way possible? The energy has to flow from here to here. How can it get from here to here if this is too big for that?
Nanoplankton.
What was that?
Nanoplankton.
Nanoplankton. So what do you mean by that?
Coccolithopers and
Like, what do you suggest to do with them? I think you're on the right track here.
what do you
Like,
mean?
how would they help?
By eating the smaller organisms. they're
Good,
able to
okay.
digest it.
So Zach is basically saying, how about get something that is small enough to eat the picoplankton, right? Something small enough to eat the picoplankton is going to be bigger than this. Maybe even big enough to be eaten by this. Are we getting it now, right? We need to come up with something in between that eats this and gets eaten by that can properly transfer the energy, right? The energy cannot transfer directly because these are too small to be eaten. That was the concept from the end of the last lecture, right? Okay, so the DOM gets eaten by the bacteria archaea. The animals in the mesoplankton cannot eat it, so they cannot get the nutrients and energy, at least yet, right? So what do we need? Exactly what we just said. Something small enough to eat the bacteria, to get the energy from the bacteria, but also it must be big enough to be eaten so that the animals can gain the energy from them. All right, so something of intermediate size, right? Let's figure out who's of intermediate size. Bacteria to zooplankton. Bacteria are picoplankton, zooplankton are mesoplankton. What are intermediate sized plankton that can fit in there? Nanoplankton, microplankton, right? Nano and microplanktons could go there. Good. So what are examples of nano and microplankton that we learned yesterday? Coccolithophores, right? What else? Do we have any other examples that we may have written down? Diatoms, right? Coccolithophores, diatom, diaphylates, exactly, the ones I put right here. But what is the problem with these?
They're all above 200 meters.
Yes, but that one's more important. They are all photosynthetic. So they cannot do this. Why not? Which one of these things cannot happen? Like what process cannot happen in here?
Listen.
No, hold on. We're talking about the fact that they do photosynthesis. So by putting this right here, which one of these processes is not occurring? This one right here. Because it's not a consumer. So it cannot eat the phytoplankton. You see what I'm saying here? It's a primary producer. These guys, they start their food chains, they start here, they don't start there, right? They don't eat anything, they're producers, so they're not above anything else. So they cannot fit in here. They can get eaten by this, but they cannot eat that. So we need to think of another nano or microplankton that goes in there. But the only ones I told you about so far are phytoplankton, which don't work. Okay? Now keep in mind, these three are all protists. Do we know of other new protists now? What do we know now that might be able to fit the bill? Radiolarians, foraminifera, exactly, right? So think about other protists that are not phytoplankton. And we got radiolarians, right? Foraminifera, and the third one? Ciliates, exactly. These ones that I finished the last lecture on, these guys can eat. They are consumers. They are protists, so they are in those size groups, right? They are the ones that are small enough and big enough at the same time. Okay, so what are we gonna put? We're gonna put nano and microplankton, non-photosynthetic protists in here. I got a better word than non-photosynthetic protists. Let's call them heterotrophic protists instead. Okay, heterotrophic. And let's quickly define what heterotrophy means. Hetero means other, trophic means basically has something to do with eating. So whenever you get your energy from eating something else, something different from yourself. Okay? So the comparison is autotroph versus heterotroph. Right? Autotrophs gets food from themselves, and heterotrophs get food from another organism. Okay, so with this definition, we can see that autotrophs are producers, they're plants and stuff like that, right? They produce their own food, whereas heterotrophs is all consumers and stuff. So what are we? Are we autotrophic or are we heterotrophic? We're heterotrophic, right? We don't produce our own food. Okay, so autotrophic organism is a plant, heterotrophic organism is something that consumes, so we need a heterotrophic protist, right? Just to make sure we know what that word means, can you give me an example of an autotrophic protist real quick? What was that? Autotrophic protist. Yeah, give me an example of an autotrophic protist. Diatom. Good, right? Sound okay? So diatom is a phytoplankton, it's a protist, therefore it's an autotrophic protist. But no, those are not the ones that will work here. The ones that will work here are heterotrophic protists. Heterotrophic protists can eat these because they're small enough to eat them, right? These guys are too big to eat these. So if we stick these here in the food chain, the energy can flow from here to here. Okay. Next, these things are also big enough to be handled by the mesoplankton, zooplankton, right? So these guys can eat these, and the energy gets transferred to this group. Once the energy gets transferred to that group, then we're all good, right? Let's go look up at the the food web again. All the DOM goes into the picoplankton. Who's the picoplankton again? Bacteria and archaea, and then these things get eaten by nano and microplankton. Who are they though? Heterotrophic. Yeah, but what is the group called? Protists. Yeah, heterotrophic protists can eat those guys, and who can eat heterotrophic protists? The zooplankton. And guess what? Zooplankton are right here. So you see it goes back into the food web. Right? These waste products are not wasted. They are returned back via this process. See how it looks like a circle or a loop? Right? And all these organisms are really small. We call this the microbial loop, right? The microbial loop is basically a recycling mechanism for the DOM nutrients using a bunch of small organisms, microbes, okay? Because DOM is really small, so you need something really small to eat it, bacteria. But then bacteria are small, so you need something else that's slightly bigger but also small to eat it, heterotrophic protists. And then you need Then, no, you don't need anything else. Heterotrophic protists are big enough to be eaten by the zooplankton here, and now we're good. Energy gets returned back to the food web. Okay? So yeah, there you go. That's the microbial loop, and this is really important. Recycling of nutrients. Because what do you guys know about the open ocean and its nutrient levels? It's very low. It's oligotrophic. Okay, you don't want to waste nutrients here. You want to use them as much as you can. You want to recycle them. And there you go. You can recycle them using this process known as the microbial loop. Okay. All right. So to recap on the whole thing, DOM is the solid waste that gets dissolved, it comes out, gets eaten by the bacteria and archaea. The bacteria and archaea then gets eaten by heterotrophic protists, right? So keep in mind, the heterotrophic protist is the most important link here, right? Because that is like the key player that joins the bacteria to the zooplankton. The zooplankton is already part of the food web, and then the bacteria is the only thing small enough to eat DOM. So who's the one that connects those two, the eaters of the DOM and the actual food web? It's the protists. Right? The heterotrophic protists are the ones connecting those two groups. Okay, so yeah, the protists are the only things big enough that for the zooplankton to actually eat, and once they eat them, then they get the energy. The nutrients are therefore recycled, right? Well, they're gonna try to. They don't recycle all of it, of course. They can only recycle 10% because of the transfer efficiency, but it's better than none, right? Okay, so I think that's it for this one, right? Yeah, that's a quiz. Okay, I think that's it for this lecture. We are gonna, let's see, maybe take another short break, and then we'll get into the last one. Okay, any questions on microbial loop? All right, so yeah.
I have a question about the transfer efficiency.
Okay, what's your question on transfer efficiency?
So is it the energy that's being transferred, or what is it that's being transferred?
It's like the combination of the energy and the molecules inside the food that gets transferred to the next higher trophic level. Okay, so when you eat something, you get food energy and you also get mass, right? And those things go into the new body that eats it, and then, but most of it comes out too. 90% comes out, but 10% stays and gets used up in the body, right? On average, at least when you're growing, right? So that's tropical transfer efficiency. Okay, and so you guys keep in mind the microbial loop is the defense against oligotrophy, right?